Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into all this material you sent over about languages in Belgium.
Belgium, huh? I mean, there's got to be more to it than just waffles and, what was it, The Adventures of Tintin?
Yeah, you're right. It's definitely not just about those things. There's a whole lot more to it, actually.
Yeah?
The linguistic scene in Belgium is way more intricate than most people even realize.
Okay, that's interesting. I got to admit, I always thought of Belgium as like a mainly French-speaking country,
Right.
but your source mentions three official languages, like officially three. So what's the deal there?
So you've got Dutch, obviously, then French and German as well.
Whoa, three! But here's the thing. Most people assume French is the main language, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But it's actually Dutch that takes the top spot as the most spoken, I mean.
No way! I totally would have thought French was the big one. So where are all these Dutch speakers hanging out?
Well, around 60% of the population speaks Dutch, mostly in the northern region. They call it Flanders.
Flanders, okay.
Think like flat landscapes, those charming medieval cities, and a culture that's pretty different from the south, where they speak French.
Okay, I'm starting to get the picture here. So where do the French speakers fit into all of this?
So French is spoken by about 40% of the population, mainly in Wallonia, the south. Think rolling hills, those cute little villages, and a bit more of a Latin feel, I guess you could say.
Gotcha.
And then there's that small German-speaking community kind of tucked away in the east.
Wow, so it's like three different cultural zones all in one country.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. And it's not just about language either. This division, I mean, it affects everything. Politics, education, even everyday things like street signs, what's on a menu, you name it.
Speaking of menus, I've always wondered about Brussels. I mean, it's the capital, right?
Right.
But it's smack dab in the middle of Flanders, which is Dutch-speaking territory. What's up with the language situation there?
Ah, Brussels. Officially, it's bilingual, but it's a bit more nuanced than that. Historically, French was the dominant language. Like, think of it as the language of power and prestige. Even though it's geographically in Flanders, French really kind of dug its roots in there.
Ah, so that's where all that tension comes in. So the source mentioned the Flemish community,
Yeah.
pushing for Dutch to get more recognition in Brussels. It makes sense now. Like their own capital city is dominated by another language.
Exactly. You've got this constant back and forth between the Flemish community wanting more visibility for Dutch and the French speakers who are used to their language kind of running the show. It's this ongoing debate, really reflecting those bigger language dynamics we see in Belgium.
I bet this whole language thing isn't exactly a new thing, right? The source mentioned something called the Flemish movement. What did they have to do with all of this?
Oh, they were super important. The Flemish movement, they really pushed hard for Dutch language rights. It was a whole fight for recognition and respect, not just being tolerated.
So what did that fight look like exactly? Was it all about getting people to speak Dutch more, or was it something bigger than that?
It was way more than just speaking the language. It was about getting Dutch recognized in schools, the government, just everyday life. They wanted to make sure it was on an equal footing with French. And trust me, it wasn't a walk in the park. There was a lot of pushback.
Wow, that's amazing. So what were some of their main tactics, I guess?
Well, one key thing was getting those Dutch language universities up and running. That was huge because it meant Flemish students could finally get a higher education in their own language, something that wasn't even possible before. They also pushed for Dutch to be used more in the courts and government administration, making sure Flemish speakers weren't at a disadvantage.
So basically they were fighting for cultural and political equality, but through language. That's incredible. Language can be such a powerful tool. It's amazing.
You got it. They understood that language was the key to keeping their cultural identity alive and making sure they had a voice in their own country. And you know what? They actually achieved a lot. Their efforts led to some big changes, like the whole setup of those linguistic regions we talked about earlier.
Wow, that's a huge win. So Belgium actually changed its political structure to make room for all its languages. That's a pretty big deal.
It really is, and it shows how important language is to the whole idea of being Belgian. But as you can probably guess, even with all these changes, the tension between the different language groups didn't just magically vanish.
Yeah, I guess you can't just erase centuries of history and cultural dynamics overnight. Speaking of history, let's dive a little deeper. Your source talked about some regional dialects, Walloon and Picard, I think. What are those all about?
Ah, those are interesting. You see, Belgium's linguistic scene is less like a neatly divided pie chart and more like a layered cake, I guess.
Okay.
These regional dialects, they're like hidden flavors, adding a whole other dimension to the story.
Okay, I'm all ears. What makes these dialects so special?
Well, they represent a deep connection to the past, to the roots of Belgian culture. Take Walloon, for example. It's a Romance language, kind of like French, but with its own unique words and sounds. You hear it mostly in Wallonia, and it's like a reminder of the region's unique heritage.
So it's like a window into the past, huh? a way to hold on to a piece of history.
Exactly. And then you've got Picard. It's another Romance language, but spoken in parts of Wallonia and even across the border into France. It's fascinating how these dialects ignore those national boundaries, really showing you how connected language and culture can be.
I like that layered cake. You peel back one layer and there's a whole new flavor waiting to be discovered. So with all these languages and dialects flying around, does everyone in Belgium just speak like everything?
Well, it's not quite that simple, but your source did mention how big of a deal language learning is in Belgium. It's not just some elective, it's a necessity.
Yeah, I can imagine. Trying to navigate that linguistic maze would be pretty impossible otherwise. So are most Belgians at least bilingual then?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Their education system is all about promoting multilingualism. Students have to learn at least one other official language, so most Belgians grow up speaking at least two.
Wow. Kind of jealous, gotta be honest. That's a pretty cool system for building understanding and making communication easier between different communities.
It really is. Makes you wonder what the world would be like if more countries did something like that, embrace the whole multilingual thing. Couldn't hurt, right?
You know what just hit me? We haven't even mentioned English yet. I mean, Brussels is a hub for all those international organizations and businesses.
Mhm.
I can't imagine English just gets ignored there.
Oh, you're right. English plays a huge role, especially in Brussels. Even though it's not an official language, it's like the common tongue for business, diplomacy, even just everyday chats between people from different backgrounds.
So it's like another layer on that linguistic cake, huh? But doesn't that make things even more interesting? I mean, with English being so, I don't know, dominant in a lot of areas, could it kind of overshadow Dutch and French?
That's a really good question, and it's something we should definitely talk more about. But how about we take a quick break and then jump back in to really unpack that issue?
Sounds good to me. I'm already hooked on this whole linguistic journey, and I'm totally ready to see where it takes us next. All right, so we were talking about English having a pretty big presence in Belgium, especially in Brussels. But how does that, I don't know, impact the dynamics between the languages that are already there? Does everyone just start speaking English, or is there like a push to keep Dutch and French important?
Well, it's not like one language just comes in and wipes out the others. It's more like English adds another, layer of complexity to what's already a pretty mixed up linguistic landscape.
I guess that makes sense, but it still raises some concerns, right? Like, what happens to Dutch and French if English becomes the language everyone needs to like succeed in business or international stuff?
That's a valid point. There are definitely people who worry about English becoming too dominant and leading to a decline in the use of Dutch and French, especially among younger people. They might see English as, I don't know, the ticket to more opportunities globally.
So it's not just about the languages themselves, it's about economics and being able to like move up in the world. It's almost like English represents, I don't know, a pathway to a wider world, while Dutch and French become more like local.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. And it really highlights the challenge a lot of multilingual countries face, how to balance the good things that come with global communication with the need to preserve their own, linguistic heritage.
It's a tough balancing act for sure. Belgium seems to be handling it pretty well, at least when it comes to encouraging multilingualism within its own borders. But what about immigration? I mean, your source mentioned that Brussels has become super diverse,
Right.
with languages like Turkish and Arabic becoming more common. How does that fit into this already pretty complicated language situation?
Well, immigration definitely adds another fascinating twist to the whole story. Belgium, like a lot of European countries, has seen a lot of immigration over the past few decades, and of course that brings in new languages and cultural influences.
So how is Belgium dealing with all of that? Are they trying to, I don't know, integrate those new languages into the system they already have, or is there like a push to keep the three official languages as the main ones?
It's a process, and it's still ongoing, and there's no easy answer. Some people argue that Belgium should just embrace this growing linguistic diversity and, support the integration of these new languages. That could involve offering language classes in schools or providing government services in multiple languages.
That makes sense if you're thinking about inclusion, but I can also see how some people might worry about like the strain on resources or even about Belgian identity getting, I don't know, diluted.
You've touched on a really important point of tension there. The whole question of national identity is so closely tied to language in Belgium, and some people are afraid that adding too many languages might weaken that sense of shared identity.
It's a delicate balancing act, isn't it? Trying to be welcoming to newcomers while also holding on to a sense of unity as a nation.
Exactly, and there's no simple solution. It needs a nuanced approach, one that recognizes the value of both linguistic diversity and national cohesion. It's a debate that'll probably keep going for a long time.
Well, it definitely adds another layer to that linguistic tapestry we were talking about. It seems like Belgium is always evolving, always trying to find ways to adapt to changing demographics and global influences, all while holding on to its unique linguistic heritage.
You've got it. Belgium really is a microcosm of the challenges and opportunities that many multilingual societies face in our globalized world. It's a fascinating example of how language can both divide and unite.
Now, before we jump into what the future holds for all these languages in Belgium, there's one more thing I wanted to touch on. Your first mentioned that Brussels' success economically attracts a lot of Flemish workers, which of course adds to the whole language mix in the city. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Sure, it's a great example of how language and economics are connected. Brussels, being the economic heart of Belgium and a major hub for international business, it naturally attracts workers from all over, including Flanders.
So you've got these Flemish speakers moving to a city where French has traditionally been the dominant language. Kind of creates a linguistic au revoir, right?
Precisely. And it brings up some interesting questions. Will this influx of Flemish workers lead to a comeback for Dutch in Brussels? Or will French maintain its strong position, especially in the professional world?
It makes me wonder about how language itself can be a kind of, I don't know, capital, a tool for economic advancement. If French remains the language of power and opportunity in Brussels, will Flemish speakers feel pressure to prioritize French over Dutch?
That's a very real concern, and it's something the Flemish community is definitely thinking about. They fought hard to make sure Dutch has equal standing in Belgium, and they don't want to see it lose ground in the capital.
It's like language becomes a marker of who you are, but also a currency in the job market, you know?
Absolutely. It's a complex mix of cultural, social, and economic forces.
So it seems like Belgium's linguistic landscape is always changing, shaped by history, politics, economics, and the ever-evolving dynamics of a globalized world.
Perfectly put. And this dynamic tension is what makes Belgium such a fascinating and relevant case study for understanding the complexities of multilingualism in the 21st century.
Well, I'm really excited to dive into what the future might hold for this linguistic melting pot. What does your source say about the potential trajectory of these languages in Belgium?
Well, they pose some interesting questions, really get you thinking. Questions like, will Dutch continue to lose ground in Brussels? And how will immigration and globalization continue to shape the language mix?
Those are big questions, and I'm definitely looking forward to hearing your thoughts. But before we get ahead of ourselves, how about we pause here and pick up the conversation in the final part of our deep dive? All right, so we've really gone deep on this. The three official languages, the Flemish movement, English, immigration. I mean, it's obvious now that Belgium's linguistic landscape is anything but straightforward. So now for the big question. What's in store for all these languages in the future?
Well, predicting the future of languages is tough, kind of like trying to figure out what the weather's going to be like weeks from now. There are so many things that could happen. But your source does bring up some really interesting points we can use to, imagine a few scenarios.
Yeah, they asked, will Dutch keep losing ground in Brussels? And honestly, thinking about how strong the city's economy is and how French has dominated for so long, that question really got me thinking. What do you make of that?
It's definitely a question a lot of people are thinking about, especially the Flemish community. Like we talked about, Brussels is kind of unique. It's in Flanders geographically where they speak Dutch, but French has always been like the language of power, the prestigious one. And now with more and more international workers and businesses coming in, English is becoming more common too.
So it's like Dutch is getting squeezed from both sides by French and English. That doesn't sound too good for the future of Dutch in Brussels.
It's a valid concern, yeah, but I wouldn't rule Dutch out completely. The Flemish community knows about this challenge, and they're really working to promote Dutch in Brussels. They've got initiatives to encourage businesses to use it, more Dutch language education, and they're trying to make cultural stuff more accessible to Dutch speakers.
So it's this constant, linguistic tug of war with each language trying to find its place in the city.
Right. And who wins this language competition? It will depend on all sorts of things, like government policies. Are there incentives for using certain languages? How the population changes? Even how people feel about different languages culturally.
And speaking of how people feel about languages, your source also asked, how will immigration and globalization continue to shape the linguistic mix? That one really caught my eye, too. We've talked about how immigration's already bringing in new languages, but how might globalization, that whole global interconnectedness thing, how might that impact the languages in Belgium?
Globalization is a huge force, and it'll probably have a big impact on the languages in Belgium, just like it has everywhere else. I mean, on the one hand, globalization can lead to these dominant languages spreading, like English, maybe at the expense of languages that aren't spoken of widely.
So it's kind of a mixed bag then. It can connect people and cultures, but also make them more similar, and that might mean some linguistic diversity gets lost.
That's the dilemma. But on the other hand, globalization can actually open up opportunities for languages that aren't as common. Think about the internet and social media. They can connect speakers of these, less common languages, create a sense of community, and maybe even encourage people to use those languages in new ways.
So it's not a given that globalization will automatically lead to just a handful of languages dominating everywhere.
Not at all. What happens to the languages in Belgium, even in the whole world, it's not set in stone. It really comes down to the choices that individuals make, the choices communities make, and the choices governments make.
That's a really powerful thought. So if language is such a big part of what it means to be Belgian, like your source said, how do you see language, I don't know, shaping the country's future?
I think language will continue to be a major factor in how Belgium's society, its politics, and its culture develop, how they handle their logistic diversity, how they deal with the challenges and opportunities of globalization, how they bring in new languages and cultures. All of that will have a huge impact on what Belgium becomes.
It's almost like a giant social experiment, and language is what's driving it.
You said it. And the results of this experiment, they won't just affect Belgium. Other countries with multiple languages all over the world will be watching and learning from what happens there. Belgium's experience can teach us so much about how to handle the complexities of language in today's globalized world.
Wow, we've really covered a lot in this deep dive. From the historical reasons behind this language divide to what might happen in the future, it's clear that the story of languages in Belgium is far from over.
Absolutely. And the best part is that we're all part of this story as it unfolds. The choices we make about the languages we speak, how we interact with other cultures, the policies we support, they all play a role in shaping the future of language in Belgium and even beyond.
I think that's a great point to wrap things up on. Thanks so much for taking us on this journey through the linguistic landscape of Belgium. It's been really eye-opening, and I'm sure our listener feels the same way.
It was my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep digging into this topic. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and never stop appreciating the incredible diversity of languages that make our world so rich. Until next time on The Deep Dive.